Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this month's talk in our lunchtime lecture series, where scholars share stories from the history of science, technology, and medicine. I'm Rohini Patel. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, Department of History, and the Haas Dissertation Fellow here at the Science History Institute. Today, I'm honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bono Shih. Before I do, I'll say a bit about the format of today's lecture. Dr. Shih will speak for about 45 minutes or so, after which we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions. You can send in your questions during the talk using the chat function here on YouTube. You'll just need to log in and we'll be collecting the questions from the chat for the Q&A. You can also email us your questions at lunchtimelectures@sciencehistory.org. That email address will be available down in the chat window throughout the talk. Now, I'm glad to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Shih is currently the Kane Postdoctoral Fellow here at the Science History Institute. He works at the intersection of philosophy, history, and sociology of engineering, with a continual and keen attention to research implications for contemporary engineering practice and education. His critical research broadly surveys historical ideas of engineering in Western civilizations since antiquity, using, for example, a linguistic genealogical approach, among others, and interrogates these ideas for their values, historical continuities, and embeddedness from military into civilian social sectors. Dr. Shih received his MS and PhD in Science and Technology Studies at Virginia Tech and has multiple publications and more in progress at the intersection of philosophy, history, and engineering education. Today, Dr. Shih will speak about dominant values in modern engineering practice, such as the prioritization of quantity, efficiency, problem solving, and better technology by identifying the linguistic conceptual genesis of engineering in military conflicts during ancient Greek and Roman times. He will discuss implications of these histories and options for contemporary engagement with such an orientation to engineering and technology. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Shih, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Rohini, for the introduction, and I'm happy to be here as a fellow of the Science History Institute and share my talk, Critiquing Engineering Practice from Archimedes to Modern Technological Progress. This is an outline of my presentation. First thing first, a background for my questions and concerns. I wanted to start with a set of internet memes about engineering in college. In this space, engineering is portrayed as a torturous major that has no personal life. By no personal life, it also means no social life. Like after 4 years of college, your best friend is a scientific calculator. And for people in my generation, these internet memes went viral when I was in college in the early 2010s, all saying that engineering is a busy and hard major. And the real-world practice as an engineer seems to contribute to low quality of life, regardless of majors. We have chemical engineers, civil engineers, electrical engineers, and computer engineers. And these ideas are not even physically remote from us. While I was an instructor in engineering education with my former university, these were the memes I would see on the first floor of the instructional building every week. But these popular images are just tips of an iceberg. If we are going to generalize about stereotypes in engineering, we can actually work on a list of dominant values and practices. These include machine, quantity, power, material, technical work, genius, secretivity, problem solving, innovation, and more. And even dominant value or practice about engineering I had on the previous slide have an opposite. They are not only marginalized, I will also argue they have not received the attention and merit they deserve. These marginalized practices include people, body, communication, ethics, empathy, maintenance, problem definition, and more. Why do these marginalized values and practices in engineering matter? I believe they have to do with diversity in engineering. Diversity is not just about the representation of people and their numbers or role models. I argue that diversity is also about the representation of knowledge and practice. What knowledge and practice are more important in engineering will encourage or discourage people with different identities. More often than not, knowledge traditionally belonging to minorities is also marginalized and discounted in engineering. I am not the only researcher thinking this way. Numerous scholars from humanities and engineering education who care about diversity and inclusion have long made an effort to challenge the dominant values and practices, including the hard stuff, problem solving, efficiency, progress, nuts and bolts, doing it the hard way, power, the social technical binary, and the idea that minorities of Black and women students are not smart enough to stay in engineering. The reference can go on. Scholars also challenge meritocracy, rigor, selectivity, innovation, outcome-based approach, problem solving for societal challenge, and the idea that anyone can be engineers, but engineering is not for everyone. The rest of my talk today will focus on three areas about dominant practice in engineering. First, I would like to show that they have their origins in ancient military conflicts and that they were mutual dependent and formed into a structure. Second, I would like to provide evidence showing how dominant practice in engineering continued to the present day. And third, based on my former analysis, I will draw a conclusion and discuss several policy recommendations for engineering education. If we look at historical dictionary of the English language, the word engineer has a couple sources, but it ultimately came from Latin ingenium. The Latin ingenium has two meanings concerning us. The first is genius and ingenuity, which indicate one's natural capacity and talent. The second is an instance of ingenuity, such as an invention. In fact, all the meanings of Latin ingeniums are included by the English word engine. The word engine also derives from the Latin ingenium. If we look at historical dictionary again, the word engine has the following meanings, including genius, ingenuity, mechanical device, and machine used in warfare. But among these meanings, it is surprise for us to realize that two very distinct meanings are included in the same word, engine. On the one hand, we have genius and ingenuity, and on the other hand, there is the word engine and word machine. So my talk today will also explain how and why the two meanings are related. To understand what engineering means, I learned ancient Greek and Latin and identify words that are close to engineering in English. These are the example of words I have studied in my research. What I found in my survey of classical literature is that there was a structure of ideas related to engineering, and their relation resembles circular reasoning. The circular structure of ideas consists of the following. It translates quantity and math into power and projects power to superiority. Retrospectively, it explains ingenuity in terms of superiority, and ingenuity is believed to contribute to quantity and math. One thing to note is that there are potentially many other ways these ideas interact. So here I call it the structure of ideas of engineering, and saying that they are circular is just one way to illustrate how they are related. But for now, let's see how these ideas support each other in a circular way by looking at one specific example. We all know Archimedes was a great mathematician and geometrician. The legend says he was so obsessed with his own work that he ran naked on the street, shouting Eureka. And he was also famous for his research on levers and said, give me a place to stand and I will move the world. The lesson known to us is how Archimedes helped defend Syracuse under the attack of the Roman Republic. He designed many ingenious defensive weapons that struck the Roman army by surprise. Let's see how ancient Greek historians told the story of how quantitative problem solving translates into power. In Plutarch's Marcellus, Archimedes alone was able to surpass forces of many men by his ingenious devices. He was said to easily and smoothly move a ship of passengers that was formerly drawn by a large number of people. In Vitruvius' architecture, it goes that mathematicians are able to easily speak against all the studies of arts because they are equipped with weapons from their own studies. And Vitruvius said Archimedes was among one of them. In the siege of Syracuse, power translates into superiority and meritocracy. According to Plutarch, the Roman commanders Marcellus exclaimed, "Let's stop fighting against this geometrical monster with 100 hands who use our ships like cups to ladle water from the sea. And with the many missiles she shoots against us all at once, outdoes the hundred-handed monsters of mythology." And Archimedes not only did better than his Roman enemies, but surpassed all the efforts of his compatriots. As Plutarch testified, all the fellows of Archimedes were the living body of his weapons, while Archimedes' single soul was moving and engaging in everything. And whenever there was superiority, historians attributed good performance to ingenuities, and oftentimes genius and talent were constructed to be the reason for excellence. Polybius the history said, Marcellus failed to consider the faculty of Archimedes and foresee that at some critical point, the single soul from one person is more effective than any number's workman's hands. Accordingly, Plutarch said Archimedes gained a name and reputation for possessing some unhuman divine intelligence. In another context, Plutarch talked about Archimedes' talents in mathematics. He said Archimedes was able to solve math problems very smoothly and quickly when no one else could do it. Plutarch used two adjectives to describe the nature of these math problems: difficult, painful, and dangerous, as well as grievous and overbearing. He gave credit for Archimedes' unusual achievement to a combination of a man's natural endowment and excessive hard work. Finally, ingenuity and talent contribute to quantitative problem solving. We have seen this in my last example, where Archimedes was able to solve difficult math problems because he was a genius. But there are more examples relevant in engineering. Pappus of Alexandria said those having engaged in science since the childhood and moreover having an age of genius would be the best inventors and architects of mechanical works. Archimedes alone has employed his genius and inventiveness for all kinds of things. And Vitruvius said, those who have been granted by nature so much ingenuity, acumen, and good memory so that they are able to learn and possess so orally the knowledge of geometry, astronomy, music, and other studies, go beyond the duty of architects and become mathematicians. So I have used the previous passage to illustrate how the dominant ideas about engineering were associated and mutually reinforced. But there is still one thing missing from the picture, which is the social political conditions making this interconnection possible. This quote from Polybius gives us a very important clue. He said, a single sword is more effective than many people's hands, but it was only at some critical moments. The critical moments proved to be the urgency of ancient siege warfare. In this particular picture from the 18th centuries, Archimedes' anti-siege weapons was deployed to capture and remove the Roman battleships in the siege of Syracuse. It cannot be overemphasized why a siege war presents an emergency, because once the walls are broken or when the gate is open, it invites the enemy to take over. It is like opening the floodgates, and there is a point of no return. According to Julius Caesar's memoirs, siege engines were at the center of the war. When they were going to besiege a town and the townspeople saw the size of their siege works, they sent envoys and surrendered. And because siege engine was so crucial for war, at one point, Julius Caesar said the labor of many months were ruined in a moment when the enemy successfully set their siege engines on fire. Because it took several months to prepare for siege engines and maintain their operations, it was customary for Caesar to spare the enemy's life if they surrendered before battery rams hit the wall. On the other hand, if the enemies resisted and Caesar's army eventually broke into the city, months of siege operation would justify plundering, mutilation of the enemy's armed force, or even genocide of the entire community. So if we return to the previous diagram, the socio-political condition for the dominant ideas of engineering were military warfare and siege wars. There is a binary difference between winning and losing a war. In ancient siege wars like the siege of Syracuse, the binary difference of the outcomes of a war could never be taken lightly. Now, if we have a picture of how the dominant ideas of engineering work in ancient times, let's move on to engineering practice in modern times. We might want to ask, how are these arguments about ancient military engineering still relevant to modern engineering practice? Or perhaps we can ask in a different way. Today, military engineering is not a prominent thing anymore. Why the specters of quantity, power, superiority, and talent from ancient times still bothers us? At the cost of oversimplifying my other research, I wish to be provocative about how the life and death in ancient military engineering translate into modern categories. The context for modern engineering practice is apparently different from the ancient times, but I argue that the matter of life and death was, for the most part, substituted by a number of modern social political conditions, and we are committed to these modern conditions no less seriously than the life and death in ancient times. These include economy and commercial competition, the imperative for technological progress under corporate capitalism, competition cultures in College of Engineering, and the difficult exams in college for the sake of selectivity. Let's look at one example from the Great Exhibition of 1851. The exhibition was not only a cultural event between nations, it was also a civilian competition and technological display between nations to show off the advancement of industrial art. In this particular artwork published around 1851, the Americans celebrated a number of victories over British invention. In the exhibitions, there were a few achievements for the American. An American locksmith was able to open the best locks in Britain. A reaper from McCormick's harvesting machine company won the gold medal prize. An American yacht called America also won a contest. In the foreground, on the left, there is an American saying, "American inventions are more successful than the British ones," and tell the British gentlemen, if you live a few years longer, we will show you greater things than these. In the background, a British man says, "Well, although we are beaten, I am not sorry. These Americans are bone of our bone, and the origins of their genius is British." In the interest of time, I'm going to provide one last example showing how socio-political conditions for engineering developments became civilian in the 19th century and continue to motivate dominant ideas of engineering. I'm citing John Hawkshaw, an English civil engineer. He recognized that in ancient Greek and Roman times, an engineer's talent was challenged to the most by siege warfare. He lamented, "Whereas great cathedrals were built, there was no comparable encouragement for engineers to work on civilian projects. But now," he continues, "his generation is seeing happiest times because there is keen competition among manufacturers and good inventions will never be ignored." Competition eventually became a culture of engineering education in the 1970s. According to historian Amy Sue Meeks, competition harnessed students to high-tech agendas set by elite patrons, as advocates sought to replace engineers' dull, nerdy image with sports-style glory. And as he also pointed out, competition cultures also trickle down to K-12 education. Ironically, if you Google engineering competition, the top result is competition targeting high school students. When there is no open competition in the classroom, students might still be competing with each other because engineering is known for selectivity. In addition to hard work, very often it takes one's talent and genius to survive the intensities of college education. So how much do the modern social political conditions of engineering get their content from ancient military engineering? This is not only an open question, but also beyond the scope of today's talk. But it is sufficient to say, since antiquity, the condition for dominant engineering practice have always been social technical practice that is urgent and has visible binary outcomes. So functionally speaking, even though the social political conditions are now different, they serve the same structure of ideas and reinforce it. And it is no exaggeration to say the military legacy is still with us today. And I say this not only because many civilian technology we have today were initially developed for military purpose. The emotional violence engineering does to some of the participants is only reminiscent of a harsh military experience, leading to stress and despair. I want to highlight the line, "I want to go home," at the bottom center of the slide. It is from Forrest Gump, and the last words after this character was fatally shot in the Vietnam War. It implies that engineering school could be a violent and cruel environment, and whoever is not capable will be eliminated. Another evidence that the military legacy of engineering is still with us is how intensive courses in engineering are now called boot camps. And most often, it is software engineering courses that are called this way. For reference, a coding boot camp is said to be hard and follow a demanding schedule and may cause difficulty for some students, and the minimum commitment is 40 hours each week. In order not to be unfair to single out software engineering, yes, there are boot camps for histories, but there are just so few of them compared to boot camps for coding. Finally, what can we get out of the previous analysis? Here, I'm going to conclude with a couple policy recommendations. The first strategy is to problematize the sociopolitical condition for dominant practice and ask the sort of philosophical questions about why we need competition and what progress we are looking for when developing technology. It is not a top secret that tech companies are spending billions of dollars on R&D to stay competitive. At the same time, there are always hidden human costs and environmental costs that are simply externalized for technology to grow. In this space, more research is needed to help us understand ethical dimensions of technology. And when it comes to progress, mainstream accounts of technological developments, such as in Encyclopedia Britannica, still give us a very linear interpretation of histories of technology. The bottom line is that we should problematize the linear model of technological developments and appreciate that there are low technology and mundane technology that are essential to the human condition. The second strategy is to neutralize the exclusive mutual reinforcement between dominant practice and make it less likely to reproduce the connection within the structure. Imagine if we break this connection so that numerical skills are not always considered powerful and superior. For example, communication skills in engineering are often undervalued and do not get the credit they deserve. So we can introduce communication as a factor that also contributes to a better engineering solution, and in this way, we disengage the previous reinforcement. For example, in higher education, instead of having our grading systems depend entirely on quantitative skills, why don't we make oral and written communication an essential part of engineering education? Here, I propose an alternative to the grading schemes that I found for two fluid dynamics classes, one from MIT and another from UC Berkeley. The third strategy is to empower alternative values and practice in engineering. From the same diagram, we know certain values have been prioritized and able to produce similar values. What is missing from the diagram is what I call alternative values in practice. It is a theoretical construct and concepts that includes values and practices that become undervalued in engineering because they are not the ideal types. Unlike dominant values and practices in engineering, their alternatives are not grounded in scientific certainty. for more skill or systematic analysis. Instead, they often turn to situational uncertainty, basic knowledge, and holistic appreciation. I compare all of these along with their corresponding dimension in this table. Again, I'm using communication as an example. Communication is often undervalued in engineering because, unlike numbers, communication has multiple meanings in different contexts and can only be understood with other reference. Communication is also taxing knowledge, is always uncertain about the effects, and requires subjective judgment about the meanings. In other words, misinterpretation and misunderstanding may happen in communication. Basically, communication cannot be a dominant practice in any possible way. By recognizing that dominant values and practices have driven what skills and knowledge are more valuable in engineering, we should subvert their entrenchment and make their alternatives equally viable. I believe this will make room for more soft skills like communication to grow. That is everything I have for today's talk. Thank you. By the way, my presentation is recorded and will be posted. So if you want to review anything, you can always go back. And if you have comments or questions but do not have a chance to put them in the chat, you are also welcome to drop me a line at my email. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Shih, for a wonderful talk. We'll be taking some questions now. So the first question is from Charlotte Abney, our director, and she says, thank you for a fascinating talk. With the field the way it is right now, do you have any advice you would give to current engineering students?
Yeah, that is really a good question. So I would say engineering is still a very broad field. So even though I mentioned like mechanical engineering and civil engineering, they focus on very narrow categories of technology, but still we have environmentals and many others like medical engineering. So one way to think about engineering is to really explore what engineering will actually encompass. So what are the possibilities that it can offer? And there are also many resources on campus that will also point to like non-dominant ways of engineering. So basically explore the possibilities. And also another way is to think out of the box. So instead of just problem solving, maybe we should also define the problems and think about the purpose of technology. Why we need like faster like CPUs and like larger or smaller devices instead of like going without electronics. That kind of very essential and fundamental question about technology. And this is where I think philosophy and engineering ethics could be of help.
Great. Thank you so much. So Becca Jackson asks, very interested in talk. Do you have thoughts on how the social and philosophical foundations of engineering has impacted demographic representation among engineers?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is also a point that is somehow implied in my talk. So for example, like communication, those kind of soft skills are institutionally and historically belonging to women, right? So as long as we don't really give reward to these kind of soft skills and kind of marginalize them into something unimportant and have the focus on the quantitative problem solving in engineering, we kind of also rule out the possibility that women and other minorities could be a legitimate participant in our field, right? So instead of thinking like engineering and soft skill are essentially belonging to what minority groups, I think of those kind of different skills as institutionally and historically belonging to certain identities of people instead of essentializing like this is like a basic traits of women and men, that kind of things. But thinking this way, we could maybe, I believe, and this is also a lot of things we are doing in higher education to also emphasize like engineering ethics and communication are also important. And not only because they belong to people who are not fitting into these engineering cultures, but also they have the potential to challenge and interrogate about the purposes and the problem solving, what problem to solve by the engineering practice. So I think, so while I want to argue in my presentation is not only the representation of people, but also the knowledge. As long as we diversify that knowledge, we can also accommodate a lot of different identities, including also men, the majority of people in engineering who don't feel like they fit into that dominant cultures.
Yeah, those are very important points. Okay, so we have a question from Gus Lester who says, "Thank you, Dr. Shih. I appreciated your highlighting the harmful values of engineering in different contexts. Could you expand on how to account for the continuities? How and why did these values move?"
Yeah, and this is really a really big question that I did in my dissertation, and I don't want to oversimplify that points, but um, say competitions in economics, like as long as we take the winning and losing of like a corporate entity as important as like survival of the individual in ancient times, we kind of perpetuate that kind of binary difference between winning and losing. So in my previous slides about competition in the Great Expedition of 1851, right? These participants really take seriously about the losing and winning of the like the competitions, and no less seriously than the life and or death of the ancient siege warfare. So I think it is the continuities are still an open questions, and I can say a couple more things about that too. Um, so um, so in my research, in my dissertation, I realized um, there is like a kind of worships of machines, like treating it like a god because of very important critical moments that machines can change everything. And in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, these literatures really belong a lot to military writings on like World War One, like where a participant treat the instruments on the aircrafts like a god because there's nothing like he could do without the instruments if he is like a military officers. But interestingly, when we look at literatures in the mid 20th century, we begin to see a lot of things like also in the late 19th centuries too, like Samuel Butler's and many other great American writers, they talk about machines in a way that it's like a god. It is like a very crucial things. But the context is no longer in military context, but in civilian competition. And think about like all the machines that are running 24/7, like my internet right now to keep my streamings and my talk going smoothly. These machines and technology are just so important that they have binary difference like in terms of the outcomes for the performance of everything we do. But they are still essential, right? They are essential for our daily life. But there are also certain other technology like the bank ATM technology and many others technology that maybe not so essential for our life, but they are still treated very essentially. Like we will notice Facebook page may be shut down because of the server failure, and that kind of things when happen, engineers will treat it as emergency, and they will gather all the resources they have to fix the problems. So I want to like kind of be provocative in terms of the metaphors between ancient siege warfare, where machines were at the center, and on the other hand, we have civilian technology and machines right now which are not treated less seriously than the ancient military engines. And we have a lot of metaphors and analogies in modern times that a machine is again changes like autonomous vehicles and artificial intelligence. We kind of reduce all the human endeavors to just one single machinery developments. And that was what exactly happening in Archimedes' efforts, because like in Archimedes' efforts, it was just not going to happen that he was the only person who was engaging in war, but historians treat it as if he were the only person in the war. And that was the irony because like in many technologies developments right now, we also see like we attribute like a lot of achievement in just one single person to engineers to machine. And that is the way like we share with the ancient counterparts of the histories.
Yeah, a lot to think about, definitely related to the contemporary context. So we have another question from Robert Davidson, who says, given the historical connections between quantitative skills and power and superiority, do you have thoughts about the current trend towards disbelief in science and technology?
Yeah, I think that is really a open and big questions. I think as long as science and engineering focus too much on quantitative and engineering and quantitative and mathematical skills, like explain the world in terms of numbers, and there's not no other possibility. I think there is like a disbelief absolutely from maybe religions and many other sectors of civilian lives that has just don't like the science and how the science and engineering has been working. And I think at the same time, science and engineering has become also aware of that disbelief and disenchantment, I would say, and begin to think about how they could be related to civilian life. So they are like scientific research on like supernature and many other things so I would say, yeah, I believe like the ways engineering and science has been working on, like focus on machines and even a mechanical interpretation of how the world is working, they also contribute to like withdrawal and disbelief in how they could like explain like how we feel about the world and many other um, feelings and experience that could not be explained by science and engineering. But at the same time, they try to connect all the cultures and different perspectives together. So I will eventually say science and engineering is just a worldviews, and it is a worldviews like just like how we see other things differently from what science and engineering could offer.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a question from our email from Roger Turner, who says, thank you for a stimulating talk. Can you talk a bit about alternative models for engineering education that don't center the destructive values that you've highlighted here?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a movement of doing introductory engineering courses in higher education. So basically what it means is that when engineering students enter college, they are required to take fundamental engineering courses. And I have been an instructor in that space for many years, and as well as being a teacher assistant for sure. And in that space, we talk a lot about communication and engineering ethics. So this is basically how we kind of decentralize the focus on numerical skills. So we not only ask students to be able to solve engineering problems, we ask them to think about ethical implication of their engineering solutions. And we talk about like how to evaluate the impacts of technology to different social groups. And we also ask them to be able to work in groups, be able to present confidently in front of audience, and also just be like, in general, just be a holistic and more sensible engineers in the fullest sense that it can imply. So I guess there are many ways that we can engage with the dominant ideas of engineering, but at the same time, I want to acknowledge our efforts, like in higher education, become diminishing in like higher level engineering courses. So imagine how you are going to incorporate engineering ethics in such courses like fluid dynamics. That's really very, very difficult. A scholar called Donald Riley has written a book, which is basically how like how to incorporate engineering ethics in fluid dynamics in that space. But it's still very difficult, and very few scholars venture to take that step, like very bold steps. And I would say there are still a lot that can be done in that space. Thank you for this question.
Thank you for your great questions and for these very informative responses. We still have a little bit of time, so please feel free to add any more questions if you'd like. And I'm going to take this opportunity to ask one of my own, if that's okay. So I thought it was great that you added also this image of the Great Exhibition, which I think was very symbolic for kind of 19th century empire and its connections to demonstrating technical supremacy as, as an indication of imperial supremacy. So I was just wondering if, in your research, if you've thought about how some of those hierarchies coming out of Western empires in more recent history relate to hierarchies of knowledge and people that you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things I have been sadly missing from my dissertation is like I wasn't able to treat like colonial experience like in a fully sense that it deserves. Maybe that was partially because I came from Taiwan, and I have also done research in that space too. But I would say dominant ideas of engineering tend to marginalize like concerns of the many developing countries. Like when we think about high technology, maybe a lot of technology, everyday technology that are essential to human lives are just excluded from that space. So I think historians of technology are ready to be very provocative about that too. When we think about technology, we think about like autonomous vehicle, drones, and spaceships, but not really drying and washing machines and vaccines and a lot of, I would say, maybe low technology, but not low as the same we thinking. So there are just so many ways that we can think in that space. And speaking of the great expeditions of 1851, it's very interesting that when they are demonstrating technology, they also draw from India and many other China a lot of technology, but this is like a display of their colonial achievement, like cottons and rubbers from India, that kind of things. So from that space, we have already seen like colonial empires like having a full sway on all the technological arrangement in that space too. I wish I could have done more research on that, but it's just a quick answer to your question.
No, that's wonderful. I was curious about more like the value structure. I know you're taking like a very long durée approach, which I think is really valuable for this research. Perhaps I can ask one more question and then we can wrap it up if there are no other questions. So I also wanted to pull a bit on your point about the idea of violence that remains in engineering education as a result of some of its military legacies that you talked about. And I'm wondering if this has a bearing for, in relationship to a lot of the other values that you mentioned, like power and superiority, in being able to justify producing certain violent technologies as well, or kind of not really thinking of them as so violent, but then just thinking of it as part of innovation, part of, and so on.
Yeah, definitely. So I talk about the binary difference of wars winning and losing, and like siege warfare, the breaking, the breaking of the walls and city gates, and that invites a lot of enemies and that kind of binary difference. And I think of that binary difference also in terms of the right and wrong answer we usually think there is in engineering, right? A lot of engineering courses just tag students with numerical skills, and once you get the answer right and you get the 4 points, but if not, maybe half points, that kind of things. So I would say the violence has to do with the binary difference that we create for students. And that kind of binary difference will have implication for example, their grades and whether or not they are able to enter a certain engineering majors. So the violence, I think, is a relative and subjective experience, but at the same time, they also has to do with binary difference. So when we talk about like how gradings in engineering can be so brutal, that brutal doesn't mean it is going to harm you physically, but it has binary implication for what you are doing as an engineer. So I think that kind of violence should be put into perspective when it comes to like the binary difference. And the binary difference have to do with the right and wrong answer we used to think like engineering has. So in order to kind of problematize that space, one strategy is to have engineering questions not have like right or wrong answers. We can ask students like open-ended questions. We can ask students to evaluate their designs not based on quantitatives, but based on aesthetics, ethics, and many things that cannot be rendered easily numerical. So I think that is my thought about your question.
That's wonderful. Thank you for answering my questions. So I think that we can wrap up here for today. And I really appreciate all those wonderful answers. I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Shih for an insightful and thought-provoking talk.
Thank you
We'll
for
hope
having
you
me.
absolutely. We hope you will all join us again in the new year for the next lecture in our series. In the meantime, for more from the Science History Institute, including updates on all our virtual programs and events, you can follow us online. We're at scihistory.org on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you all for joining us. Wishing you a peaceful and restful end of the year, and we'll see you in 2023.